The morning Elias Cutter found the woman half buried in a snowdrift at the edge of his property, he had not spoken to another living soul in 11 months, and he had certainly never once spoken to God. She was lying face down in the white, one arm stretched out ahead of her as though she had been reaching for something just beyond her grasp, when the cold finally took her legs from under her. The snow had drifted up around her shoulders and hips, and if the gray gelding had not spooked at the smell of her, the scent of something living buried in the cold, Elias might have ridden right past without ever knowing she was there. He pulled back on the reins and dropped from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. His boots punched through the icy crust, and he was on his knees beside her in an instant, his big hands brushing the snow away from her face, turning her over with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew him, which was no one, because Elias Cutter knew no one and preferred it that way. Her face was pale as birch bark. Her lips had gone faintly blue at the edges, but when he pressed 2 thick fingers to the side of her neck, there was a pulse, thin as a thread, but there. He did not waste another second. He gathered her up off the ground the way you might lift something precious, one arm beneath her knees and one beneath her shoulders, and he carried her to the horse without straining a single visible muscle. She weighed almost nothing against his chest. He settled her across the saddle, swung up behind her, and kicked the gelding into a hard canter back toward the cabin. That was the 23rd of November, 1878, in the high country of Colorado, where the San Juan Mountains wore winter like a shroud, and where a man could go from one season to the next without ever seeing another face. Elias had come here by choice, 3 years prior, after a life that had used him hard and put him back on the shelf with all the good knocked out of him. He had built his cabin himself, square-cut logs, a stone chimney, a low roof that held the heat, and he had made himself a life that required nothing from anyone. He was 32 years old, wide across the shoulders, with forearms roped with muscle from years of swinging an axe and hauling timber and wrestling the land into submission. His hair was dark and long, falling past his collar, and his jaw was perpetually rough with a few days of stubble that never quite became a full beard and never quite went away. His hands were enormous and scarred and capable. There was a seriousness to his face that people, back when there had been people, often mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was simply the expression of a man who had decided that the world was something to be endured rather than enjoyed, and who had organized his entire life around that decision. He had no use for churches. He had no use for prayers. He had tried that once, as a boy, when his mother was dying of fever, and the preacher came and told them all to get on their knees. And Elias had gotten on his knees and prayed harder than any 10-year-old had ever prayed, and his mother had died anyway by morning. After that, the whole arrangement had seemed to him not merely useless, but actively insulting, and he had never revisited it. He carried the woman inside and laid her on his bed, which was the only bed in the cabin, a sturdy frame he had built from pine with a thick mattress stuffed with dried grass and covered in 2 heavy quilts. He pulled off her boots, leather, cracked and soaking, the feet inside them ice cold, and wrapped her feet in a dry wool blanket. He stoked the fire in the stone hearth until it was blazing, and then he pulled a chair up close to the bed and sat down and looked at her. She was young, 20, maybe 21 or 22 at the most. Her hair was dark brown, spread out across his pillow in loose waves, and even pale and half frozen as she was, there was a quality to her face that made it impossible to look away. Not merely beautiful in the conventional way, though she was that too. It was something in the architecture of her, the strong line of her jaw, the dark sweep of her brows, the fullness of her mouth. She wore a traveling dress that had once been respectable, but had seen hard days. There was dried mud on the hem, and the left sleeve had been torn and clumsily mended. Whoever she was, she had been traveling hard. He stripped off her wet outer garments, working efficiently and keeping his eyes on the task, and wrapped her in the second quilt from the chest at the foot of his bed. He made a thick broth from a piece of dried venison and some dried herbs he kept in a tin on the shelf, and when she stirred, sometime in the late afternoon, he helped her sit up enough to drink it. She opened her eyes for just a moment, brown eyes, dark and deep as creek water, and looked at him with an expression of total confusion before her lids fell closed again. He said, "You are safe," and was startled by the sound of his own voice, rough from disuse. She did not respond. She slept. He pulled the chair closer to the fire and sat through the night, adding wood to the flames every hour, watching the color slowly come back into her face. By midnight, she had stopped shivering. By 3 in the morning, her lips had gone from blue back to the pale pink of someone merely cold rather than dying. He slept for an hour in the chair just before dawn, waking with a stiff neck and the fire burned low, and he rebuilt it immediately and went to check on her. She was breathing steadily. He let himself exhale. She slept through the next day and most of the night that followed. He melted snow for water and got a little more broth into her in the evening. He sat beside her and listened to her breathe and thought about who she might be and where she had been going and what in the world had brought her out into the high country alone in November, with winter already set in hard. On the morning of the second day, she woke. He was at the fire when he heard the rustle of the quilts and turned to find her sitting up in the bed, looking around the cabin with wide, cautious eyes. She pulled the quilt up to her chin when she saw him, and he raised both hands, a gesture he had not made in years, an old gesture of non-threat, and said, "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you." She studied him for a long moment. He understood that he was a great deal of man to find standing in a small cabin when you woke up not knowing where you were. He stayed where he was, near the fire, and gave her the space to take in the room at her own pace. "Where am I?" Her voice was rough and dry. "My cabin, about 6 miles east of the pass." "The pass?" She seemed to be working something out. "I was trying to reach Silverton." "You were about 11 miles short of it," he said, "and you were buried in a snowdrift." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, some of the wariness had given way to something more like exhaustion. "How long have I been here?" 2 nights and a day, going on 2 days now." She looked down at herself and back up at him. "I took your wet clothes off," he said. "Nothing more than that. They are hanging by the fire." She nodded slowly. "Thank you." A pause. "I'm Clara Holt." "Elias Cutter." "Mr. Cutter." Another pause, longer. "You saved my life." He looked at her evenly. "You would have frozen to death within the hour." "Yes," she said. "I know." She said it plainly, without drama, and he found he respected that. She was not going to make a performance out of gratitude or distress. She was simply going to acknowledge what was true and move forward from it. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "Desperately," she said, and something shifted in her face, a faint, uncertain smile, the first he had seen from her, like a candle lit behind a window. He turned back to the fire and started making breakfast. Her story came out over the next several hours in pieces, between long stretches of rest, because she tired easily, and he could see it in her face and kept his questions minimal. She had come from Missouri, from a small town east of Kansas City. Her father had died in the summer, a fall from a wagon, quick and senseless, and had left behind more debts than land. Her mother had died 2 years earlier from fever. She was alone and largely without resources, and she had a cousin in Silverton who had written to say there was work there, respectable work in a dry goods store, and she had packed what she could carry and come west. The stage had been caught in a storm crossing the pass. The driver had made the wrong call and pushed through rather than turning back, and the coach had overturned on an icy grade. No one had been killed, but the driver had broken his leg badly, and one of the other passengers, a merchant from Denver, had taken charge and turned everyone back toward the last way station. Clara had argued for pushing forward. Silverton was closer ahead than the way station was behind them, she'd said. No one had listened to her. And so she had, at some point in the argument, made a decision that even she seemed to understand, in retrospect, was not her finest, and had set off on foot toward Silverton alone. "That was not wise," Elias said. "No," she agreed without defensiveness. "It was not, but I was cold and frightened, and I was certain I knew better than I did." He looked at her. "What made you certain?" She thought about it. "I'd walked 11 miles in a day before. I thought 11 miles was 11 miles. In November, in the San Juans." "I understand the error now," she said, and there was something in her voice that was dry and self-aware, and made him want, almost involuntarily, to smile. He did not smile, but he noted the impulse, because it was unusual. She healed quickly in the physical sense. By the 3rd day she was up and moving around the cabin, wrapped in one of his quilts like a large and dignified bird. She found his shelf of books. He had 8, which was more than most mountain men, but fewer than any man who considered himself well-read. And she ran her finger along the spines with an expression of quiet pleasure that he found himself watching when he should have been attending to other things. She asked if she might borrow one. He said yes. She chose a battered copy of Jane Eyre that he had traded a good skinning knife for 2 years ago from a passing trapper who seemed not to have read it and could not have explained why he was carrying it. "Have you read this?" she asked. "Twice," he said. She looked at him then the way people sometimes look at a landscape that turns out to be different from what they expected. Not disappointed exactly, but recalibrated, adjusted, as if a thing they thought they had fully accounted for had just revealed an additional dimension. "Twice," she repeated. "I have 8 books in long winters," he said. She smiled then, a real one, not the faint uncertain flicker of the first morning, and he felt it somewhere in the vicinity of his sternum like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for a very long time. He went out to check the traps and chop wood, and he did not think about it. Or rather, he thought about nothing else for the entire 2 hours he was outside, and told himself very firmly that he was not thinking about it, which amounted to the same thing in the end. The snow kept falling. The pass stayed closed. He told her on the 4th day that she would not be able to reach Silverton until there was a break in the weather, and that breaks in the weather in the San Juans in November were not scheduled events. She might be here for another few days. She might be here for a week. She took this with a composure that surprised him. She said, "Then I will help where I can." He said, "You don't need to." She said, "I know I don't need to. I want to." She cooked. He had not eaten food cooked by another person in almost a year, and the first time she made a proper meal from the stores he had laid in for winter, dried beans and smoked pork and cornbread from the sack of cornmeal on the shelf. He ate it with a seriousness that was almost reverent, though he said nothing about it. She seemed to know anyway. She watched him from across the table with that slight, knowing smile, and said nothing either, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was something else, something he did not have a word for, which was unusual, because he was not a man who typically struggled for words. She found his journal on the 5th day, not snooping, just reaching for it by mistake when she meant to take the inkwell from the shelf, and apologized immediately and set it back down. He told her she could look if she wanted. She said she would not. He told her it was mostly observations about weather and wildlife and the state of the traps. She said that still did not make it hers to look at. He studied her for a moment and said, "Most people would have looked anyway." "I am not most people," she said simply, and went back to darning the torn sleeve of her dress, and he turned back to oiling the rifle, and that was the end of the conversation, but it sat with him all day and into the evening like a warm coal in his chest. On the 6th day, the snow stopped. He went out at first light and read the sky, the temperature, the feel of the air, and came back inside and told her the break might last 2 or 3 days, long enough, if she moved quickly, to reach Silverton. He would take her himself. He knew the pass better than anyone, knew which routes were safe and which were not, and on horseback with him, knowing the way it would take 5 hours at a steady pace. She looked at him from across the cabin, and he thought he saw something move across her face. Not reluctance exactly, more like a conflict being silently conducted and resolved. "When would we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning, first light. Give the cold one more night to set the surface hard." She nodded. "All right." That evening she cooked again, used the last of the flour to make proper biscuits, which he suspected she had been saving because she had known she was leaving soon and wanted to use what she could. And they ate together at the rough table he had built from 2 split logs and ate in a silence that had changed character again, become something heavier, something with a weight to it. He said, "Your cousin, in Silverton. You are certain the offer is still good?" "Her last letter came in August," Clara said. "She said to come as soon as I could." "That was 4 months ago." "Yes." He turned his tin cup in his hands. "People's circumstances change." She looked at him. "Are you trying to tell me something, Mr. Cutter?" He met her eyes. "I'm trying to say that if the situation has changed, you should not consider yourself without options." She was quiet for a moment. What options would those be? He was quiet too, and he was not entirely sure, when he opened his mouth, what was going to come out of it. "You could stay," he said. "Until spring at least. There is room, and I have enough stores laid in for 2. She studied him with those dark, serious eyes, and he could not read what was in them, which was an unfamiliar experience. He was generally good at reading people. Animals, too. It was something you developed out here, or you made mistakes that cost you. "Why?" she asked. It was a simple question, and it deserved a simple answer, and the simple answer was that he had not wanted something in a very long time, and he wanted her to stay. But he did not say that. He said, "It is a hard country and a hard winter, and you have nowhere certain to go." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I think I would like to continue to Silverton. I made a commitment to my cousin, and I intend to keep it." A pause. "But I appreciate the offer, Mr. Cutter. More than you know." He nodded. He poured more coffee and did not say anything else about it, and she did not either, and they went on like that until the fire burned low and she retired to his bed, and he settled into the chair that had become his bed for the past week, and he lay there looking at the dark ceiling and feeling the weight of an absence that had not yet occurred and was already making itself felt. He did not sleep much. He lay there, and he thought about the strange machinery of fate that had sent her into that snowdrift and sent him riding past at precisely the right moment. He thought about her voice when she said things like, "I am not most people." He thought about the way she moved around the cabin, competent and quiet, not walking around him, but not deferring to him either, simply existing in the same space with a kind of self-possession that he found extraordinary and a little devastating. He thought about prayer for the first time in 22 years, without any specific intent, the way you might look at a locked door you had stopped expecting to ever open, not hoping, just remembering that the door was there. In the morning, he saddled the gelding and loaded her few belongings into the saddlebag, and they went out into the gray-white cold and began the climb to the pass. It was a hard ride. The trail was obliterated under 2 feet of snow, and he navigated by memory and instinct and the shapes of the land beneath the white. The cold was a physical force, pressing against any exposed skin with serious intent. He kept them moving steadily, not fast but not slow, and he read the conditions constantly, the sky, the surface, the sound the snow made under the horse's hooves, and adjusted their route accordingly. She rode behind him, her arms around his waist for warmth and balance, and he was acutely aware of every point of contact between her body and his, and said nothing about it, and breathed the cold air and kept his eyes on the trail. They reached the top of the pass a little after noon. The sky had gone white and flat overhead, which he did not like. That kind of sky could mean more snow, maybe soon. But the pass itself was clear enough to move through, and on the downslope the trail was easier to read. They descended at a careful pace, and the wind picked up and she pressed closer against his back, and he felt her shivering through his coat. He said, "Not much further. 2 hours, maybe less." She said, "I'm all right." He thought she probably was, but he put his hand briefly over hers where it rested against his ribs, and she stilled, and neither of them mentioned it after. Silverton was a real town in 1878, a mining town in the belly of the San Juans, raw and loud and full of men who had come for silver and were staying for whatever reason the mountains had assigned them. It smelled of wood smoke and mud and animal, and the main street was a churned-up ruin of snow and boot prints and wheel tracks. Clara sat up behind him, and he felt her taking it in. He found his way to the address she had from her cousin's letter, a house on a side street, respectable enough, 2 stories with a proper glass window in the front. He helped her down from the horse, and she stood in the frozen street with her bag and looked up at the house and then back at him. "Thank you, Mr. Cutter," she said, "for all of it." He was still holding the reins. He looked at her in the flat winter light, and he thought that she looked very small standing there, and very brave, and he wanted to say about 15 different things and said none of them. He said, "Take care of yourself, Miss Holt." She nodded. She looked at him for a moment longer, that same look, the recalibrating look, and then she turned and walked up to the door of the house and knocked. A woman opened the door almost immediately, a woman with Clara's dark eyes and a cry of genuine pleasure, and pulled her inside, and the door closed, and Elias sat on his horse in the cold street and felt the specific weight of something ending that had barely had time to begin. He rode back to the mountain. The winter settled in around him like a hand closing into a fist. He kept to his routines because routines were what kept a man from going sideways in a long winter alone. He checked the traps every other morning and reset them. He split wood. He patched the corner of the roof where snowmelt was finding a way through the logs. He cooked simple things and ate them without much attention, and sat by the fire in the evenings and tried to read and found himself reading the same page 3 or 4 times without absorbing it. He kept the book she had read, Jane Eyre, on the table beside the fire instead of on the shelf where it belonged. He told himself this was because it was the book he was currently reading. He was not currently reading it. He was staring at it and thinking about the way she had smiled over it and the way she had said twice, as if it told her something important about him that she was glad to know. December came in hard. He had a wolf problem with the trapline and spent 3 days tracking it, which was good because it kept him busy and tired was useful. He found the wolf on the 3rd day, a gray female, thin and desperate from the hard winter, and he stood there in the snow with his rifle and looked at her for a long time, and then he packed up and went home and relocated 3 of the traps rather than shooting her. He thought about that later and was not sure what to make of it. He had always been pragmatic about the business of surviving in the mountains. Something had shifted in him, some narrow thing had opened up, and he did not know precisely when or why, though he had his suspicions. He told himself that, come spring, he would take the furs down to Silverton to trade. That was a normal thing, a practical thing, nothing unusual about it. He told himself this with great conviction and moderate success. January was hard. February was harder. A cold snap came in the last week of February that dropped the temperature so low that the pitch in the cabin logs cracked and the fire could barely keep the air above freezing, and he burned through wood at a rate that had him hauling from the store he had stacked against the back wall and watching the stack diminish with an eye on the sky. He wore every piece of clothing he owned and slept close to the fire, and was fine, because he was Elias Cutter, and he had survived worse, though for a few nights it was close enough that he acknowledged the narrowness of it. It was on the 3rd night of that cold snap, lying on his side with the fire 6 feet away and the wind screaming against the roof and the temperature dropping with every hour, that he thought again about prayer. Not as a locked door this time, as something more urgent. Not for himself, he was not afraid for himself, or not much, but for a sort of abstract, desperate hope that she was warm wherever she was. That Silverton had enough coal, that the house on the side street with the glass window was holding its heat. He did not pray, but he thought about it, and that was new enough. March came, and the cold eased its grip by degrees. The snowpack was still deep, but the temperature lifted, and there were days of pale sunshine that hit the snow and sent up a blinding white light that made everything look briefly miraculous. He started ranging further from the cabin again, checking the upper trapline, reading the signs that spring left on the land before winter released it, the particular sound of water moving under ice, the way the chickadees came back to the spruce trees near the creek. He did not go to Silverton. He told himself there was no pressing reason. The furs could wait, the trading could wait. It made more practical sense to go when the trail was fully clear. He told himself this through all of March and half of April, with decreasing conviction. It was the middle of April when the rider came. He heard the horse before he saw it. The sound carried differently in spring, the snow gone from the ground in the lower stretches, and he came out of the cabin to watch the figure come up the trail through the aspens. He stood with his arms at his sides and watched, and as the rider came close enough to resolve out of the silver green of the new leaves, he recognized the dark hair and the particular way she sat a horse, straight-backed and deliberate even on a borrowed animal. He stood there while she rode up and stopped and looked down at him. "Miss Holt," he said. "Mr. Cutter," she said. She looked different. Not worse at all, but different from how he had held her in his memory these 4 months. Warmer, more present, more real than the version he had been carrying around, which he supposed was inevitable. She dismounted without waiting for his help and tied the horse to the fence post and stood facing him. "My cousin's husband owns the dry goods store," she said, And it turned out his intention was for me to help serve customers and also to eventually marry his brother, who is 53 years old and smells of pipe tobacco and has a disposition like bad weather. She looked at him steadily. I quit the job in January. I've been working at the hotel since then, in the kitchen, and I've been trying to decide whether to go back to Missouri or to come here. He was very still. You said there were options, she said. I said you could stay until spring, he said. It is spring, she said. He looked at her for a long, full moment. The aspens were turning their new leaves in a wind that came down off the mountain smelling of snowmelt and pine, and the sky above the peaks was a blue so pure it seemed unlikely. And she was standing in his yard with her chin up and her dark eyes steady and 4 months of distance between them, closing in a breath. He said, "Come inside." She came inside. He put the coffee on, and she sat at the table, and they talked for 3 hours, real talking, the kind that builds something between two people rather than just passing time. She told him about Silverton, the mines, the noise, the extraordinary mud season, the women who worked the laundry and the women who worked the hotel, and the one woman who ran the assay office and would brook no comment about it. He told her about the winter, the wolf, the cold snap in February. She asked about the wolf, and he told her about standing there with the rifle and deciding not to. She was quiet for a moment when he finished telling it. Then she said, "You are not who you appear to be at first." He said, "Who do I appear to be at first?" She considered. "A man who is done with the world." He looked at his coffee cup. "I was. What changed?" He met her eyes. "You know what changed." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked down at the table, and a color came into her face that was very becoming, and he felt that lock turning again, rusty hinges swinging slow. "I can earn my keep," she said, looking up. "I'm not looking for charity." "I know you're not. I can cook and I can mend and I can learn whatever else needs doing. I know that too. And She stopped. She looked at him directly. "I'm not afraid of you. Some women would be." "I know," he said. "I want you to know that I am here because I want to be, not because I have nowhere else to go. I have other options, worse ones, but other ones." He studied her. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because I want you to know that when I am here, I am choosing to be here. It matters to me that you understand that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It matters to me too." She stayed. The weeks that followed were a kind of happiness that Elias had no previous experience with, and therefore no framework for. And he moved through it carefully, the way you move through new ice, testing each step. She took the bed. He made himself a bunk on the far wall and told her he had been meaning to do it for years anyway, which was not precisely true, but was not entirely false either. She rearranged the shelves and organized the stores with a methodical efficiency that he both admired and found faintly amusing. She planted a kitchen garden in the patch of south-facing ground beside the cabin, working the cold earth with a spade and planting seeds she had brought from Silverton. He built her a proper fence for it to keep the deer out. They worked well together. He had not known how much he had missed having someone to work alongside until it was happening again. She was not delicate about it. She carried her own weight and then some, hauling water and tending the animals and chopping kindling without being asked. And when she was tired, she said so plainly. And when she needed help, she asked for it directly. And when she disagreed with him, she said that too. In a clear, firm voice that reminded him of the sound water makes when it moves over clean rock. They argued about the garden. He said the soil up here was too cold and too thin to grow much. She said she knew that, and she had chosen accordingly. He said the frost would come back in September and kill anything tender. She said she was not planting anything tender. He said the deer would get through even the fence he had built if they were determined enough. She pointed out that he was very good at shooting deer if it came to that. He had no counter-argument for this. By June, the garden was producing small green things with determination, and she was insufferably pleased about it, and he was also pleased, which he managed to convey only by eating a radish one evening and saying it was not bad, which, from him, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. He had fallen in love with her by the second week. He knew it the way he knew weather, not as a revelation, but as a recognition, as if something he had observed accumulating over time had finally reached a threshold. He was not sure what to do with it. He was not a man with a great deal of experience being in love, and his experience in general had taught him to hold things carefully rather than to declare them. She knew how he felt. Oh, he was certain of that, because she was perceptive in a way that moved quietly and missed very little. She had known, he suspected, since Silverton, or maybe before, but she was also patient in a way that came from genuine confidence rather than passive waiting. She was not holding her breath. She was simply going on with the business of living and giving him the space to arrive at whatever he was going to arrive at, in his own time, at his own pace. He arrived at it on a Thursday evening in late June, after supper, sitting on the step of the cabin in the long amber light with the mountains going gold above them. She was beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and he could smell the clean warmth of her skin and the faint scent of the garden on her hands. He said, "Clara," she said. "Yes," he said. "I do not have smooth words for this," she said. "I know," he said. "I think you already know what I mean to say," she said. "I think I do." "Then let me say it anyway," he said. He turned to look at her, this woman who had reorganized his shelves and saved a wolf from his rifle without knowing it, and made him read the same page of a book 50 times by simply existing in the same world. "I have not felt anything I wanted to keep in a very long time. I feel it now." She looked at him in the long gold light. Her eyes were very dark and very steady. "I feel it too," she said quietly, in case that was not obvious. He put his hand along her jaw very carefully, and she turned her face into it, and he kissed her once with a seriousness that matched everything else about him, and she kissed him back with a warmth that matched everything about her, and the mountains stood above them in the last of the day's light, indifferent and eternal, which did not matter at all. Summer opened up around them in the way that Colorado summers open, which is to say, spectacularly. The high meadows going green and gold, the creek running high and clear with snowmelt, the elk moving up into the upper pastures, and the hawks circling in thermals above the ridgeline. They worked and talked and sat together in the evenings, and the distance between them collapsed naturally, organically, the way rivers find their way to the sea. She laughed more easily than he did, and this did not bother him. He was quiet more often than she was, and this did not bother her. They fit in the way that particular things fit, not easily or loosely, but precisely, the way a well-made joint fits, snug and permanent. He asked her to marry him in August, in the garden, with dirt on her hands and on his, which was not the most romantic setting, but was a perfectly honest one. He had the ring from his mother, which he'd carried for 22 years without knowing why. He had taken it out of the leather pouch it lived in the night before and looked at it for a long time, a thin gold band with a small garnet, modest and genuine, and had known, with the absolute certainty that is the exclusive property of things that have been decided at depth, that this was what it had been waiting for. She said yes before he finished asking, and then she looked at the ring on her hand and looked up at him and said, "Where did this come from?" And he told her, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she stood up and put her arms around his neck and held on, and he held her back with the full weight of his arms, and the garden grew green around them in the August warmth. They were married in September, in Silverton, before a judge, with 2 witnesses from the hotel where Clara had briefly worked, a woman named Pearl and her husband, a quiet Irishman named Murphy, who shook Elias's hand with genuine feeling and told him Clara was the best thing that had ever come through that hotel kitchen, which Elias believed entirely. Clara wore her best dress, which was not very fine but fit her beautifully, and she pinned her dark hair up and wore the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's. Elias wore his least worn shirt and had shaved for the first time in weeks, which Clara had requested and which he honored without complaint. He stood beside her before the judge and said his vows in a clear, steady voice, looking at her face, and she said hers, looking back at him with those dark, serious eyes. And then she was his wife, and he was her husband, and the world had rearranged itself around this fact without any fuss. They stayed one night at the hotel and ate a proper supper in the dining room and drank a glass of wine each, which was 2 glasses more than Elias had drunk in the past year, and he watched his wife across the table. His wife, a word he was still getting used to the weight of, laugh at something Pearl said, and then look over at him with a softness that was only his, a private expression she saved for when no one else was looking, and he felt something in him that had been braced against the world since he was 10 years old quietly, permanently lower its guard. They rode home the next morning, and the mountains were going red and gold above them, and the air had the particular bite that September carries in the high country, clean and sharp and full of the smell of coming change. She rode her own horse this time. They had bought her a small bay mare in Silverton, sensible and sure-footed, and she rode well, as it turned out, from years of farm work in Missouri. He watched her on the trail ahead of him and thought he had never seen anything that belonged more completely in this landscape. The autumn was good, the best autumn he could remember. They put up stores for winter with a thoroughness that impressed even him. She had learned from the previous season's near miss, she said, and she was determined not to be caught short. The root vegetables from the garden came in better than either of them had expected. She canned what she could can and dried what she could dry, and the shelves he had built and she had reorganized were full in a way that satisfied something very deep in him, the old animal instinct for winter readiness. He built a second room onto the cabin in October, working before the ground froze, adding 8 feet on the south side with a second small window. She did not ask for it. He built it because they would need it eventually, he thought, and because the cabin was his but the home was theirs, and the home should be larger. She came out and stood beside him when the frame was up and looked at it for a while. "It faces the garden," she said. "Yes." "You did that on purpose." He said nothing, which was answer enough. She leaned her shoulder against his arm. He put his arm around her shoulders. They stood and looked at the new room taking shape, and the garden gone brown and dry in the October cold, ready for next spring, and the mountains above it all, white at the tops now, and everything was good. Everything was the best it had ever been. And then Clara got sick. It began as a cold, or what seemed like one, a cough that developed the 3rd week of October, a low fever that he noticed when he pressed his hand to her forehead one evening and found it warmer than it should have been. He was not immediately alarmed. People got colds. The temperature had dropped sharply and they had been working hard outside in the damp, and she had probably overdone it. He told her to rest. She said she was fine. He said he knew she was fine, but she should rest anyway. She rested for 1 day and was back at full tilt the next, and for a week it seemed like she had been right and he had been wrong, and the cold was passing. Then it was not passing. By early November the cough had deepened. It was not the bright, sharp cough of a simple cold, but something heavier, settling into her chest, and she tired more easily than before, and there were evenings when the fever came back, and her eyes had a brightness to them that was the wrong kind of brightness, the kind that comes from inside and is not happiness. He watched her across the fire and kept his face still, and the fear moved in him like water finding its way under a foundation, quietly and with terrible patience. He brought up the subject of the doctor in Silverton. She said, "It is just a chest cold. I have had them before." He said, "This one is not getting better." She said, "It will. Give it time." He gave it time. He gave it another week, during which she continued working, and he watched her with a scrutiny he tried to conceal because he knew it would worry her, and the cough did not improve, and the fever came and went, but the coming was more frequent than the going, and there were 2 mornings in that week when she woke sweating through the quilts, with a heat that frightened him even though he said nothing. On a Monday morning in mid-November, exactly 1 year since he had found her in the snowdrift, he saddled both horses before she was up and came back inside and told her they were going to Silverton. She looked at him from the bed, sitting up, the quilt around her shoulders, and in the morning light she was pale in a way that made his chest feel like something was pulling it shut, and he thought of the day he had found her and the blue at the edges of her lips, and something in him that was not rational, but was nevertheless completely certain said, "Not again, not this time, not this." "Elias," she began. "We are going," he said. His voice was quiet and absolute, the voice he used for facts, not arguments. She looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "All right." The ride to Silverton was hard. She tired quickly on horseback, which was new. She had always been comfortable on the mare. and they stopped twice for her to rest, and he watched her breathing with a clinical attention that he directed all his will toward keeping off his face. The weather held. The sky was cold and clear, and the trail was firm, and they made Silverton by early afternoon. The doctor in Silverton in 1878 was a man named Harlan Webb, who was competent by the standards of his time and sober most mornings, which put him ahead of some. He had a proper examination room in a building off the main street, and he listened to Clara's chest with the stethoscope that represented the forward edge of medical technology in the San Juan Mountains, and he examined her carefully, and he took Elias aside afterward and spoke to him in a low, serious voice. He said it was pleurisy, possibly developing into something more. The lung inflammation was significant. She needed rest, complete rest, no cold air, no exertion. He had laudanum for the pain when the coughing became severe, and there was a tonic he could make up. But the most important things were warmth and rest and time. The mountain air, he said, with a certain delicacy, was perhaps not the ideal environment for a woman in this condition. Elias listened to all of this with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and asked what would happen if she stayed on the mountain where it was warm and the air was clean and she had someone to take care of her. The doctor said that warm meant warm, not cold, and a cabin in the San Juans in November was not what he meant by warm. Elias said he would keep it warm. The doctor looked at him and seemed to decide that arguing with Elias Cutter about what he would and would not do was not a fight worth undertaking. He gave them the laudanum and the instructions for the tonic and a list of things to watch for, any worsening of the fever, any change in the quality of the cough, any blood, and told Elias that if any of those things happened, he needed to bring her back immediately regardless of the weather. They spent that night at the hotel. Pearl gave them her best room, with an extra blanket brought up without being asked, and she sat with Clara that evening while Elias went to the general store and bought everything on the doctor's list, and some things not on it, more laudanum, more tonic ingredients. Honey, a particular kind of tea he'd heard, had properties useful for chest ailments, 2 more wool blankets of the heaviest weight, a bag of the hardwood charcoal that burned hotter and longer than the pine he used at home. He came back and Clara was asleep already, which was good, and Pearl was sitting in the chair by the fire with her knitting, and she looked up at him as he came in, and something in his face must have told her enough, because she said quietly, "She is strong, Mr. Cutter." He set the bags down on the table. "I know she is. People recover from this. Many people." "Yes," he said. Pearl looked at him for a moment. "Are you all right?" He looked at his wife asleep in the good bed, the lamplight on her pale face, and he said, "I will be," which was not quite an answer to the question she had asked, but was the most honest thing he could say. He sat up that night in the chair beside the bed and he listened to her breathe. She breathed unevenly, with a shallow quality that made him aware of every breath in a way he had never been aware of breathing before. This thing you did without thinking until the moment it might stop. He sat and listened, and the fire in the hotel room burned, and the night went long and quiet around him. And somewhere in the middle of that night, around 2 a.m, he thought, though time had gotten strange, Elias Cutter did something he had not done since he was 10 years old, kneeling beside his mother's bed with the preacher and the candles and the absolute desperate faith of a child who does not yet know that faith is sometimes not enough. He folded his big scarred hands together, and he bowed his head, and he prayed. Not eloquently, not with the formal language of the churches he had avoided all his adult life, not with any theology or any confidence in the mechanics of the thing. He prayed the way a man prays when he has run out of every other option, and the thing he most fears losing is lying 6 feet away breathing too shallowly in a hotel bed when he has done every practical thing he can do, and there is still a gap between what he can do and what he needs to happen, and the gap is unbearable. He said quietly to whatever was listening, to the darkness, to the fire, to the mountains outside, to something larger than himself that he had refused to address for 22 years. "Please do not take her. I know I have not spoken to you before, or not in a very long time. I know I have not given you much reason to listen. But she is. She is everything good that has happened to me. She is the only thing. So please." He stopped. The fire cracked in the grate. Clara breathed. "Please," he said again, and could not find any more words, but pressed his hands together harder, as if the pressure of them might convey what language could not. He did not know if prayer worked. He had decided 22 years ago that it did not. But he was kneeling beside the chair with his hands together and his head bowed, and the not knowing seemed less important than the doing, and the doing felt necessary in a way he could not argue with, even internally, even in the privacy of his own rigorously unsentimental mind. He prayed for a long time. The winter settled in hard and long around the cabin in the San Juans, and Elias Cutter tended his wife through it with a focus that excluded everything else. He kept the fire burning through the night and through the day, burning at a level that kept the air inside the cabin warm enough that he often worked in his shirt sleeves, while the temperature outside dropped to levels that would be dangerous to anyone unprepared. He built up the woodpile to a reserve he had never bothered to maintain before, because it had only ever been himself to consider. The tonic was a foul-smelling combination of things the doctor had written down, involving pine resin and dried herbs and a small amount of something chemical he had bought from the apothecary in Silverton. He made it every 3 days and gave it to Clara twice a day with the expression of a man who will not be argued with, and she made a face every single time she drank it, and every single time he remained unmoved. And this small, recurring battle became a kind of intimacy of its own, a daily proof that they were still both there. She rested. This was difficult for her. She was not a woman built for lying still, and after the first week of the illness, when she had felt genuinely too unwell to do much else, the enforced rest began to chafe. She wanted to cook. She wanted to tend the fire. She wanted to review the stores and plan the spring garden. He brought her the stores ledger and let her work on the planting plans from the bed, and he did the cooking, which was not as good as hers but was not bad either, and she made occasional editorial comments about the seasoning from across the room, and he made adjustments, and this too became a kind of language they developed between them. The fever broke and returned and broke and returned. Each time it returned, he felt the fear tighten in him like a rope under strain, and each time it broke, he allowed himself to breathe, and each night, without exception, he prayed. He prayed in the chair beside the bed. He prayed in the early mornings before she was awake, quietly, in the language of a man who has decided that consistency matters even if certainty is not available. He prayed without knowing if it did anything, and he did it anyway, because the alternative was sitting in the dark with the fear and nothing to do with his hands and his heart, and prayer was something. It was an act in the direction of hope when hope was the only thing he had left to offer. He thought sometimes about his mother, about the boy kneeling beside her bed with the preacher, about deciding, after she was gone, that prayer was a lie. He thought now that he had perhaps made that decision at the wrong moment, in the wrong direction. Not because prayer had failed, he still did not know, could not know whether it had, but because the boy who had been kneeling had been right about something, even if the conclusion he had drawn was wrong. The boy had understood, even at 10, that some things require you to acknowledge their importance by doing something that costs you something. Prayer cost him something. It cost him pride, and it cost him the comfortable certainty of a man who has made up his mind, and that cost seemed appropriate for the thing he was asking. He thought about this in the long nights beside the fire while Clara slept, and it did not resolve into anything neat or theological, and he did not need it to. He prayed and he tended the fire, and he checked her fever, and he went out in the bitter cold each morning to feed the horses and chop the wood and bring in water, and he came back inside, and the cabin was warm, and she was still there. In December, she had a setback. The cough worsened dramatically over 2 days, becoming violent and exhausting, and the fever spiked higher than it had before, and he sat beside her through the worst of it with the laudanum and the cool cloth and his hand on her back during the coughing, which seemed to help. And he watched her face for the things the doctor had told him to watch for, and he prayed more intensely than he had prayed yet. He told her, on the second night of the setback, when the fever was highest and she was half delirious, and he was sitting on the edge of the bed with her hand in both of his, "You are not going anywhere. Do you hear me? You are staying right here." She looked at him through the fog of the fever and said, in a voice that was hoarse from coughing, but steady with an effort that made him ache, "I know that, Elias." He pressed her hand between his. I mean it." "I know you mean it," she said. And then, after a moment, "I mean it too." He leaned his forehead down to touch her hand, which was not a thing he would have done a year ago, was not a thing he had the capacity for a year ago, and stayed like that for a moment in the quiet of the cabin. That night he rode to Silverton in the cold and dark and woke the doctor from his bed and brought him back. Webb came without complaint, to his credit, and he examined Clara in the lamplight while Elias stood by the fire and watched, and when it was done, Webb told him the same as before: warmth, rest, the tonic, and added that the setback was not unexpected and did not necessarily indicate deterioration. The body fought these things in surges, he said. The fact that she was fighting was a good sign. "She is very strong," he said, looking at Elias, "and she has excellent care. Those things matter more than the medicine, most of the time." After the doctor left, Elias rebuilt the fire to its maximum and sat down in the chair and prayed again, longer than he had before. And when he finished, he stayed with his hands together in the dark and the fire and said, plainly, out loud, in the way a man speaks when he has decided that the other party to the conversation is real enough to deserve honesty, "I have not asked you for anything in 22 years. I have not been a man who believed in asking. I am asking now. I'm asking for her to be well, and I am telling you that I will not stop asking until she is." He paused. "And after that," he said, "I will keep asking, because I understand now why it matters." Clara slept and the fire burned, and the mountains held the cold world in their vast, indifferent grip, and Elias Cutter kept his vigil. Christmas came and went. He marked it only by making the best meal he could from what they had: a venison roast he had been saving, the last of the dried apples made into something approximating a pie, a small luxury of sugar he had brought from Silverton, and they ate it together at the table, her first time at the table in 2 weeks, wrapped in her quilt, and he looked at her across the food and the candle he had lit, and she looked back at him, and they said nothing for a moment because nothing needed to be said. She was a little better. Not well, not anything like well, but the setback of December had retreated, and she was on the other side of it, and the fever was lower and the cough less violent, and she had eaten half her plate, which was double what she had managed the day before. "Merry Christmas, Elias," she said. "Merry Christmas," he said, and it came out softer than he intended, which did not bother him the way it once would have. January came in cold but not vicious, and she improved. Slowly, with setbacks and good days and mediocre days, the way recovery happens in real life rather than in stories. Not a clean line upward, but a ragged one, 2 good days and 1 bad, 3 good and 2 difficult. The bad days less severe each time, the good days a little more solid. The fever came less and less. The cough thinned. He kept giving her the tonic with the same implacable expression, and she kept making the same face, and the exchange felt, by January, less like a crisis and more like a habit, and the shift of it from one to the other was the most welcome change he had ever experienced. He did not stop praying. He had told whatever was listening that he would not stop, and he was a man who kept his word about everything else and saw no reason to be less consistent about this. He prayed every morning and every night, briefly in the mornings because there was work to do, longer in the evenings when the cabin was quiet and the fire was steady and his wife was warm and breathing in the next room. The prayers changed as she improved, less desperate, less anguished, more like a conversation than a plea, more like gratitude, even when she was still sick, because she was still there, and gratitude seemed the right response to that. He prayed for the wolf one morning in January, because he thought of her and wondered how she was doing, and the prayer habit had expanded to fill a space that had previously been empty in him, and prayer seemed like a reasonable thing to extend in the direction of a thin gray female wolf trying to survive a Colorado winter. He recognized that this was a change in himself that would have been incomprehensible to the man he had been before, and he noted it with the particular wry clarity of a person watching themselves become someone better. February. Clara made it through February. The mornings she was up before him, which had not happened since October. He came out of the new room he had moved into when she was at her worst, to give her more space and more quiet, to find her at the fire with the coffee already on, and the sight of her there in the early morning light was so ordinary and so extraordinary simultaneously that he stood in the doorway for a moment, just absorbing it. She looked up and smiled. "You look surprised." "I am," he said. "Did you pray this morning?" He looked at her. "You know about that." Elias. She had the patient expression of a woman who has been very still for a very long time and has had little else to do but notice things. "You've been praying every night for 3 months in the next room. The walls are logs, they are not particularly thick." He came to the table and sat down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I started in November, in the hotel, the first night." She nodded slowly. "I had not prayed since I was 10 years old," he said. "My mother died. I decided it did not work." She was quiet for a moment. What changed? He looked at her across the table, this woman he had found in a snowdrift and saved and been saved by, who had come back to his mountain by choice, who had filled his shelves and his garden and his cabin and his life with the particular warmth of someone who had decided to be genuinely present. He said, "The thought of losing you was something I could not manage alone." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "You did not lose me." "No," he said. "Do you think the praying helped?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "I do not know. I think it helped me. I think it changed what I was doing with the fear. I could not sit with it and do nothing." He paused. "And I meant what I said about not stopping." She turned his hand over in both of hers and looked at it, this big, scarred hand, capable of felling trees and setting traps and carrying an unconscious woman out of a snowdrift and pressing together in the dark of a log cabin while the mountains stood outside and the fire burned low and she fought for her life. She pressed it between her palms. "Good," she said quietly. "Do not stop." Spring arrived in the high country the way it always does, reluctantly and in pieces, the snow giving up its hold on the ground in patches, the creek speaking before the meadows opened. Clara was well by March, not fragile well, not the kind of well that requires constant monitoring and a low fire and the tonic twice a day, but genuinely well. Color in her face, steadiness in her step, the cough reduced to a rare and minor thing that no longer stopped him breathing every time he heard it. She was in the garden in April, the same south-facing patch, turning the soil with the same spade, and he came out to watch her from the doorway, and she did not look up, but she said, "Do not say anything about whether the soil is warm enough," he said. "The soil is cold." She said, "Go chop something." He laughed. It came out of him unexpectedly, a real laugh, the kind that doesn't have time to be self-conscious. She turned around and looked at him with an expression of absolute delight, as if this were a better thing than any medicine. He went and chopped something, still smiling. The spring and summer of 1879 were the finest he had known. There was a fullness to them that had not existed in any previous summer of his adult life, a quality of richness that had nothing to do with the weather or the land or the state of his trapline, though all of those things were good and had everything to do with Clara moving through the days beside him, alive and well and fully herself, her laugh coming easier than it once had, her step more deliberate, as if she had come back from the illness slightly different, not weakened, but changed in the way that significant experiences change people, with a knowledge in her that had not been there before. She had been a strong woman when she arrived. She was a formidable one now. There was a steadiness in her that went all the way down, and he understood it because he had watched her fight for her life with the same practicality she brought to everything else, the same clear-eyed refusal to give more ground than absolutely necessary. He told her this one evening, trying to put it into words, which was harder than chopping wood, but he attempted it. She listened, and then she said, "You were there. That was most of it." "That is not true." "It is partially true." He considered this. "I prayed." "Yes, I know. Every night, sometimes twice." She smiled at him, that private smile, the one saved for him. "I heard you, most nights toward the end." A pause. It was a comfort. Even on the nights when I felt very bad and the dark seemed very long, I could hear you, and it helped. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that had become habitual, familiar, his in a way that the gesture itself seemed almost to understand. "Then it worked for something," he said. She caught his hand against her face. It worked for everything, she said. He found that he did not need to say anything after that. In July, Clara told him she was going to have a child. She told him in the morning, before the fire, while they were having coffee. She said it plainly and directly, which was how she said everything, watching his face while she said it to see what was there. What was there was a succession of things: surprise, a very brief visit from something that looked like fear, and then something that had no name he knew, but that reorganized his entire internal landscape in the space of 3 seconds and left it unrecognizable, except that it was better. He set his cup down carefully. He said, "Are you certain?" She said, "Yes." He said, "How long?" She said, "March, I think. Maybe April." He got up from the table and crossed the room and pulled her to her feet and held her against his chest with the full, careful pressure of a man who is aware that what he is holding is the most important thing he has ever been given to hold. She had her face against his neck and her arms around him, and he felt her breathing steady and sure, the breathing of a woman who had fought her way back to the world and intended to stay in it. He prayed that evening with his face turned toward whatever was listening, and he said thank you for a longer time than he had said anything before. The summer passed in a particular happiness that included a great deal of discussion about the new room, whether it would need a second window, whether the floor was level enough, whether the small iron stove he had bought in Silverton in June would be adequate to keep it warm. Clara had strong opinions about all of this. He had strong opinions too, and they negotiated each point with the good-natured thoroughness of two people who have learned that the other party's strong opinions are usually worth considering, even when wrong. He built the second window. He releveled the floor. They agreed on the placement of the small stove after a disagreement that lasted 4 days and ended in a compromise that satisfied both of them better than either original position had. He was beginning to understand that this was one of the particular excellences of having a wife who thought carefully and argued honestly. The compromises were usually better than what either of you had started with. He went to Silverton in August to sell the season's furs and buy supplies, and came back with a set of small cotton blankets that he had chosen with a seriousness that the man in the general store found amusing and that he did not find amusing at all, and Clara took them and held them and looked at him over them with an expression that was impossible to describe except as love, plain and full and entirely requited. Autumn came, and the mountains went gold and red, and the preparations for winter had a different quality that year, more thorough, more layered, carried out with the knowledge of what the previous winter had cost, and the determination that this one would be different. He built up the wood pile to a height that would have seemed excessive to anyone not named Elias Cutter, who had spent the previous winter watching his wife fight for her life in a log cabin while the temperature outside was trying to kill her. She did not argue about the wood pile. She also did not argue when he went to Silverton in late September and came back with Dr. Webb in the back of the wagon, having arranged for him to spend the winter months in their area, accommodated at the Weston Ranch 4 miles down the valley, which needed a doctor's presence anyway for the rancher's elderly mother. Webb seemed to find the arrangement agreeable. Elias had been persuasive and had paid above the usual rate. Clara received the news of this arrangement with a silence that lasted long enough that he began to review whether he should have asked her first, and then she said, "Thank you, Elias," in a voice that told him he had done the right thing and that she was not going to make a fuss about it, but that she knew what it had cost him in pride to arrange it and appreciated that he had. October arrived, and the cold came in behind it, and the cabin was warm, and the stores were full, and the small stove in the new room burned steadily. And Clara went to bed earlier in the evenings and slept deeply, and he sat by the main fire and prayed and thought about spring. The baby arrived on a night in late March, 1880. Dr. Webb came when Elias rode to fetch him at 3 in the morning, and was there through the hours that followed, and Elias split enough firewood in the yard between summons and waiting to last until the following Christmas, which was how he managed the fear. Clara was not afraid, or did not appear to be, which he found both reassuring and incredible, and he told her so at one point through the partially open door, and she told him that she was a little afraid, but that she had survived worse, and to please stop talking to her through the door. He stopped talking to her through the door. He went back to the woodpile. The baby was born just before dawn, a boy, strong and vocal about his arrival, with a set of lungs that impressed even Webb, who had attended a great many births and was not easily impressed. Elias came inside when Webb called him and stood in the doorway of the new room and looked at his wife in the lamplight with his son against her chest. And he was a large, quiet man who had spent the better part of his adult life deciding that the world was something to be endured. And he stood there and felt the foundation of that decision crumble completely, quietly, and without any regret. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and Clara turned the baby toward him so he could see his face, small and serious and red and absolutely certain of his own importance. And she said, "Hello, Father," to him, teasing gently, because she knew it would take him a moment to absorb it. It took him a moment. Then he put one enormous, careful finger against the baby's hand, and the baby's hand closed around it with a grip that had no business being that strong. And Elias said, "Hello," in a voice that was rougher than usual, and cleared his throat and looked at his wife, who was looking at him with the soft, private expression that meant more to him than anything he had ever been told in words. "What shall we call him?" she asked. He thought of his mother. He thought of the ring, thin gold and garnet, that was on Clara's hand right now. He thought of 22 years of silence and one night in a hotel room in Silverton when he had broken it, and what had come of that, and the things he understood now that he had not understood before. "Thomas," he said, after his mother's father, the one family member he had known and trusted before he came to the mountains and trusted no one. "Thomas Samuel Cutter." She tried the name out. "Thomas Samuel Cutter." She looked down at the boy who had closed his eyes and was making small, emphatic sounds of complaint about the recent upheaval. "It suits him." Thomas Samuel Cutter suited himself to the mountain life with a promptness that was charming and exhausting in equal measure. He was a solid child, serious-faced like his father, but with his mother's quick dark eyes and her habit of watching everything carefully before deciding how to respond. And he was crawling by July and pulling himself upright by October and walking by the following February, at 11 months, with the single-minded determination of someone who has decided a thing is going to happen and sees no reason to consult a schedule about it. The cabin had expanded twice more by the time Thomas was 2, a proper second room added onto the original addition, and a covered porch along the south side that Clara had asked for and Elias had built in a summer of sustained effort. The porch faced the garden, which had doubled in size, and in the evenings they sat there after Thomas was in bed, and the mountains went dark above them, and the stars came out in the particular abundance that the high country allows, and they talked or were quiet, and both were good. He still prayed every morning and every night. It had become, without drama, one of the organizing practices of his day, as natural as checking the weather and as necessary to him as coffee. It had changed since the desperate hotel room prayers of November 1878 had grown quieter, more conversational, more encompassing. He prayed for Clara and Thomas and for the wolf and the land and the things he was grateful for and the things he was unsure about. He prayed when Thomas was sick with a winter cold that made his breathing ragged for 3 terrible days and then passed completely. He prayed when the creek ran high in spring and threatened the lower field. He prayed on ordinary days when nothing was wrong and everything was well, because the habit had taught him that those days were the most worth praying about, the days when the world is simply there, warm and present and alive, and you are in it alongside the people you love. Clara came out one morning and found him on the porch step, head bowed, hands together, the mountains spread out above them in the first light, and she sat down beside him and did not say anything. And when he finished, she said, "Amen," which she had not said before, and which he received with a quiet sideways glance that told her he was glad. Thomas grew up hearing his father pray, which is its own kind of education, and understood without being told that it was something his father did with full sincerity and without any self-consciousness, in the way that the best habits are held, not as performance, but as practice, not as show, but as substance. 2 years after Thomas, Clara told him again, in the same way as before, morning, coffee, plain and direct, watching his face. This time, there was no succession of emotions, or there was, but it moved much faster and arrived at the same place immediately. That reorganization of the internal landscape, the one without a name, the better one. A girl arrived in the spring, smaller than Thomas had been and quieter about it, with a composure at birth that seemed to have been there from the start. Clara named her Ruth, after her own mother, and held her up in the lamplight so Elias could see her face, and he looked at this daughter of his and thought that he would have been very different from the man who found a woman in a snowdrift. He would never have been this man at all if he had been right about the locked door. If he had been correct, at 10 years old in grief and rage, to decide that the door would never open. He had been wrong. He was glad, with a gladness that had no bottom to it, that he had been wrong. He took Ruth and held her in his arms, which had been built for hard labor, but had learned a different kind of careful in the years since, and looked down at her, and she opened her eyes and looked back with an expression of frank appraisal that reminded him almost comically of her mother. Clara was laughing softly, watching them. "She is looking at you like she is deciding what she thinks," Clara said. "That is her mother's look," he said. "It is," Clara agreed. "You should get used to it. I suspect you will be seeing it twice as often from now on." He looked up at his wife, lamplight on her face, Thomas asleep in the next room, Ruth in his arms, the fire going in the hearth, the mountains outside the window holding the world in their ancient grip. And he held all of it for a moment, deliberately, with the full attention of a man who has learned the very hard way that the things you hold matter, and that holding them is not something you can take for granted or return to later, because later is not promised. He prayed that night with particular gratitude. He prayed for Ruth and for Thomas and for Clara, always for Clara, and he prayed for the thin gray wolf who was probably long gone now but who deserved to be remembered, and he prayed for his mother, which he had started doing sometime in the second winter, after he had begun to understand prayer differently and had realized that the boy kneeling beside her bed had not been wrong to pray, and that the prayers had perhaps mattered after all in ways he had not been old enough to recognize. The years went on. They were good years. Thomas grew into a boy with his father's frame and his mother's wit, who could read by 4 and identify 12 different birds by 5, and who asked questions so relentlessly that his father occasionally had to go outside and chop something in order to think about the answers, which Thomas understood and accepted as part of how his father operated. Ruth grew into a girl with dark eyes that missed nothing and a self-possession that was quietly formidable, who could outride her brother by 8 and handle a horse with a competence that made Elias, who prided himself on his horsemanship, quietly and deeply proud. Clara's health never gave them the same fright as that first winter, though there were colds and a wrenched back one autumn, and a difficult summer when the well went bad and they boiled everything for 3 months. And through all of it, Elias watched and tended and prayed, and through all of it she was fine, was more than fine, was present in the world with a fullness that seemed, if anything, to increase with the years, as though she were still accumulating the life she had almost not had. He built more onto the cabin, a real barn eventually, a smokehouse, a root cellar with proper timber framing. He hired help in the summer months as the operation grew, 2 men from Silverton who were good workers and uncomplicated in the way that suited the mountain, and who understood that Elias Cutter was not a man who invited familiarity, but was fair and honest, and expected both qualities in return. The mountain property became a proper homestead over the years, shaped by work and intention and the specific vision of a man who had stopped enduring the world and started building something in it. Silverton grew too. The mining brought more people in throughout the 1880s, and the town acquired a proper school in 1883, to which Thomas and Ruth rode 4 miles down the valley 3 days a week through the school year, on the 2 reliable horses that Elias had specifically selected for the purpose, and from which they returned full of information and opinion that kept the evenings lively. Clara taught them both to read long before the school arrived, and arithmetic too, at the table in the evenings, and the school found them so well prepared that the teacher, a young woman from Ohio, who seemed both pleased and slightly alarmed by the Cutter children, said they were the best prepared students she had. Clara was pleased by this with a satisfaction that was entirely unapologetic. Elias was also pleased and somewhat more quiet about it, but Thomas and Ruth both knew, because they were their mother's children, and read faces with the skill of the highly observant, and they knew that when their father was very quiet, it was often because he was very glad. The spring of 1885 was remarkable. Elias turned 40 that April, a fact he acknowledged with the same equanimity he brought to all factual information, and Clara made him a cake from the last of the winter flour, and Thomas and Ruth made him a card together, Ruth having drawn a picture on the front that was a surprisingly good likeness of the mountain, and Thomas having written inside it a message that ran to 4 lines and said, among other things, that he hoped to be half the man his father was, which Elias read and folded carefully and put in his jacket pocket and did not comment on, but which Clara saw him take out and read again that evening when he thought she was not watching. He had not known, before Clara, that he was a man who could be loved like that. He had not thought of himself as a man who deserved to be. He understood now that both of those beliefs had been errors, not just limitations, but active misdirections, things he had accepted too early and held too long. He understood this the way he understood everything, not with feeling so much as with a clear-eyed acknowledgement of the evidence, and the evidence of the past 7 years was comprehensive and unambiguous. He was loved. He loved back with everything in him. And the prayer that had begun in a hotel room in Silverton on a cold November night, born out of desperation and a broken open heart, had become the rope he held in the dark, the daily practice of a man who had learned, late but not too late, that gratitude is not weakness, that hope is not foolishness, and that the locked door he had decided at 10 years old would never open had been waiting, all along, for him to be the one to try it. He prayed on the morning of his 40th birthday, on the south porch with the mountains in early spring light, the snow still on the upper peaks but the lower meadows showing green, the aspen buds just beginning to break on the white-barked trees along the creek. He prayed the way he always prayed, without formality, in plain language, with the directness of a man who has learned to say what he means. He prayed for Clara and the children. He prayed for the homestead and the coming season. He prayed for the people in Silverton who were still finding their way, and for the miners underground in the dark, and for the women running laundry operations and assay offices with their chins up, and for every other soul trying to make something real in this hard and beautiful country. Then he sat for a moment in the quiet and the light and listened to the morning, the creek, the birds, the sound of Thomas up already and feeding the horses in the barn, the smell of Clara's coffee drifting through the open door, and felt with the full weight of his chest how large and consequential it all was. This ordinary morning, this particular light, the specific smell of coffee in a specific cabin on a specific mountain in Colorado in 1885 with these people in it. Clara came out and put a cup in his hand and sat beside him. They did not need to say anything. They had been not saying things beside each other for 7 years and had become expert at it, at the comfortable and full silence of two people who have talked and fought and laughed and prayed their way through enough that the silences have weight and meaning of their own. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side and they drank their coffee together in the spring light. After a while she said, 40, he said. Yes. How does it feel? He considered this seriously, as he considered everything. Like 20 with more information, he said. She laughed, that laugh, the one he had been keeping himself warm on since November 1878, and leaned her head against his shoulder. Thomas came out of the barn and saw them on the porch and said, "Happy birthday, Pa," with the slightly embarrassed sincerity of a 12-year-old who is not sure what the appropriate level of feeling is but is going to attempt it anyway. And Elias said, "Thank you, son," and meant it with his whole heart. Ruth came out behind her brother and said, "Are we having cake for breakfast?" Which was not a question. Clara said no. Ruth said she thought the birthday person should be able to choose. Elias said he believed the cake was for dinner, not breakfast. Ruth said this was a missed opportunity. Clara gave her a look. Ruth redirected her energy toward feeding the chickens, which was her morning task, and went off toward the coop with the proprietary stride of a 7-year-old who has been told no by the two most formidable people in her known world and is managing her feelings about it. Elias watched her go and thought about everything she was going to become, this daughter of his, with her mother's eyes and her mother's unbreakable sense of herself, and felt the same thing he always felt when he looked at his children, which was the same thing at the bottom as what he felt when he looked at Clara, something large and wordless, something that required prayer to hold properly, because there were no words for it that were big enough. The morning went on. The mountain stood above them, as it always had, old and enormous and entirely unmoved by the small human dramas at its foot. The creek ran. The aspens moved in the wind that came down from the upper peaks. The horses were fed, and the chickens were fed, and the fire was tended, and the coffee was drunk. And eventually, there was cake. And it was the best cake Elias had eaten in his adult life, which he said directly and without embarrassment, which made Clara say that this was the nicest thing he had said in at least a week, and Thomas say that he said nice things all the time, just quietly, and Ruth say that she agreed with her mother because the week standard was more accurate. He laughed again. The second unexpected laugh in his many years, which at the rate he was going meant he was becoming a different person entirely, and he found he did not mind. That night, after the children were in bed and the fire had burned to coals and the mountain was dark and enormous, outside the window, he and Clara sat on the south porch in the cool April dark, and he told her what he had been thinking about on the porch that morning. Not with great ceremony or any particular preparation, just the way they talked, directly, plainly, in the trust they had built over 7 years of choosing each other every day. He said, "I think about the snowdrift sometimes," she said. "The one you found me in." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" He said, "I think about what would have happened if I had not been riding in that direction, if the horse had not spooked." He paused. "If I had done anything differently." She said, "You saved my life." "You saved mine," he said, in a way that is less obvious but just as true. She turned to look at him in the dark. "I was not living," he said. "I was enduring. I had decided that was the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "You came and you reorganized my shelves and argued with me about the garden soil and read my books and came back to me across the snow in spring, and you showed me that they are not the same thing." She put her hand on his, which was on the porch rail between them, and he turned it over and held hers. "And the praying," he said, "that was you too. Or it was the fear of losing you. But the fear turned into something else after, and what it turned into I am grateful for." She said, "I know." He said, "I mean it." "I know you mean it," she said. "You always mean everything." He tightened his hand around hers. The mountain was dark above them, and the stars were out in numbers that the high country produces with extravagant generosity. And far down in the valley, the lights of Silverton were a faint scatter against the dark, the town that had grown in the 7 years since they first rode into it on the gray gelding. Him silent, her behind him, both of them still strangers to each other and to whatever was coming. He looked at the stars. He thought about the boy with the locked door. He thought about the man who had ridden past a snowdrift and found something he had not known he was looking for. He thought about the hotel room and the desperate folded hands and the prayer that had come out of him like a cry, without theology or form, just need and love and the refusal to give the fear the last word. He thought about everything he had been given and everything he had built and everything he had become, here on this mountain, in this life, with this woman beside him. He said quietly to the stars and the mountains and whatever had been listening all along, "Thank you." Just that. Thank you for the snowdrift and the horse that spooked and the cold that drove her to his door and the illness that broke him open and the prayer that he had been given back after 22 years away from it and the life, the full, real, consequential life that had come of all of it. Clara leaned her head against his arm. "Still praying?" she said, her voice soft. "Still praying," he said. She smiled and he felt it against his shoulder. "Good," she said. "Do not stop." He never did.